line. I want to start by recognizing and thanking the brave officer who gave his life defending innocent civilians in Colorado, and also his family. And just note that this last year has been a terrible year for assaults on police officers, law enforcement of all kinds across our country. We're seeing in my home state of Missouri, assaults on police officers have been at record highs in 2020. We're seeing it across the country. We're seeing surges in the crime rate, in the murder rate. It's been an unbelievable trend line that we're on, and the assaults on law enforcement have got to stop. Ms. Ware, let me begin with you, if I could. We're hearing a lot about universal background checks and how important they are to make sure that private parties don't exchange weapons, sell weapons among themselves without getting a check. I'm just wondering, how does this work in practice? I mean, how do you know if it's private parties and not registered licensed sellers, but two private individuals? How does law enforcement, when they go to enforce a universal background check requirement between private persons, how do they know that there's actually that the relevant transactions have been recorded? I mean, how do you actually make this work in practice?
Senator, thank you for your question. And I think you hit at one of the biggest problems with enforcement of these laws is that the way that they work is primarily retrospective in nature, that a crime is committed and then we have, law enforcement has access to the gun, they look at it and they say, okay, where did this come from? And they sort of backtrack and figure out it was done illegally through a private sale, or even if you were to pass H.R. 8, for example, that individual did not go through a background check, and then you retrospectively punish that individual. It doesn't do a whole lot prospectively to stop those transactions. So even if you look at, again, things like private sales through what I would call publicly advertised private sales, things like Arms List or Craigslist sales, those types of things, the way that the law is written and the way that most of these laws are written is that it doesn't stop the public advertisement of these sales, and there's no way of actually tracking, did this person who advertised this meet up and go through a background check? And frankly, the people who are already willing to break current laws are going to continue to break those laws. They're not going to say, oh, well, the government said I have to go through a background check to do this, when they're already willing to sell to criminals or to skirt those laws. Just because it's doubly illegal is not going to matter to them.
I just wonder where this is headed. I mean, where are we actually going with these proposals? It seems to me that the way, if you really want a universal background check law to be truly effective and enforceable, you've got to have some kind of a firearm registry. I mean, you've got to actually know what firearms are out there, how they're registered, where they're changing hands. I mean, otherwise, between private parties, for the reasons you've just articulated, it doesn't seem like it's going to be terribly effective. So is that where we're headed towards here in order to make this effective at the end of the day?
Senator, that would seem to be the case. And this is not me advocating for a registry, but it would seem to be the case that, if the concern is private transfers, the best way of even retrospectively enforcing that is through a sort of gun registry. But again, this starts hitting at other problems where trust is broken down between gun owners and frankly, the government, where there is this fear when you have politicians going around saying, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, that any sort of gun registration system is going to be used in the future as sort of the launching pad for the next step and then the next step and then the next step.
Yeah, and we know that comment about it taking away your AR-15, and we know that's not hypothetical in the sense that we've had pretty much the entire party that sits on the other side of this dais advocating in their presidential primaries last year, right through the presidential election, talking about the need to take away the guns of law-abiding citizens. I mean, many of them advocating a national gun registry. So this isn't something that's a hypothetical. This is something I think that's a very real and distinct possibility. Dr. Hupp, let me just ask you to comment on this. I mean, do you want to weigh in as someone who has seen this personally? What's your view here of where this is headed, where these proposals are headed?
Well, I think it's interesting that, in this country, we recognize that thousands of people die in car accidents every year. But at the same time, we are cognizant of the fact that people use their vehicles on a daily basis for good purposes, millions and millions of times. I think it's interesting that when we talk about gun usage, nobody ever mentions the fact that guns are used defensively. It's estimated about 2.5 million times per year. So it's very difficult for us to count how many lives have been saved. It's kind of hard to count a negative. I think it's just very important that we look at history, and we know that there is a tendency for governments to become overwhelming at times. And so, yes, I think there is a fear amongst many of us that we would create that fertile ground for future confiscation. I think the one witness made it very clear. He said, you know, you can't have, I believe he said, you can't have gun violence if there aren't any guns. And I think essentially that's what many on the other side would prefer.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.